idea is that these presentations will explore some of these ethical questions and put them on the table for discussion. Rather than introducing each of our speakers now and doing it again when they start, what I propose to do is to shift to our first presentation now. Basically, I'll introduce the later speakers a little later on. Our first speaker is Christopher Mills. Chris is an associate professor of law at the University of Warwick. He has written on various topics in legal and political philosophy. He works on autonomy, choice, consent, justification, the relationship between those things and ideals of neutrality in the public realm. So, Chris, thank you very much for contributing, and take it away. I think you have some slides. Are you going to try sharing those yourself, or would you like?
I'm going to try. I'm going to press this big green button down here saying share screen. I'm going to see where we end up. Okay, here, that's PowerPoint. I'm sharing PowerPoint to you, apparently. What can you see?
That's worked. Perfect.
Good. Do I need to go into a slideshow?
I think you do.
If I do that, is that better?
That's even better than it was previously.
Yeah. Does that work for everyone? Okay, and if I do this, yeah, forward, backward, lovely. Okay, thank you, Ben. As Ben suggested, I've written on some topics, that is true. So today's talk is, I thought it would be useful for the project to present a paper with essentially no thesis or conclusion, because I thought that would be an interesting proposition. But instead, as Ben suggested, if the idea now is to kind of pivot and to think about normative considerations in a kind of slightly broad manner, that's exactly what I'm intending to do here. So the sort of process behind the paper was I went back and watched all the previous ones and kind of caught up on all the previous workshops, and I drew out a series of issues that were raised in those talks, which looked like they had kind of ethical significance to me, and then scratched my head about them for a bit and developed them a bit. And then I chucked a few in of my own as well. And so the idea is we have a happy mix of issues, some of which kind of draws on and seeks to develop what's gone before in the workshop, and some which are throwing in kind of new ideas, hopefully. That's the idea. And then the structure is just a kind of four-part structure. So I've categorized my concerns. First is methodological, which is distinctive, because that's how should we thinking about augmented reality. And then the other three are ethical concerns. So the first one is how to think about these ethical concerns, and then the other three are, here are some ethical concerns to think about. And the first two, distributive illegitimacy, they're kind of standard political concerns. And then the vague category of interpersonal worries will come along at the end. But hopefully all will remain clear. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so first step, methodological worries. So yeah, one of the concerns I had looking through the previous sessions is I was interested in thinking about, well, so there's two worries. One is, I think when some people think about applied ethics, they have a kind of crude view of applied ethics in mind. And I've put it here as like there's a kind of crude trap that we ought to be trying to avoid. And so I think that when we think about applying ethical considerations to technological innovation, I think there's a particular way we should do that, and we should think about doing that. And that is helpful both in terms of like setting up other papers and thinking about the concepts more broadly, but also it's helpful for when it comes to things like the knowledge exchange with people who are philosophers, or, as I'll suggest in a minute, comparing different branches of philosophy. So one of my thoughts is it might be that the ethical part of this project just looks a bit different or develops in a slightly different way from the epistemological part, for example. And so my first set of worries are all about those sorts of ideas. So here's the trap, or pair of traps, I think. So I think there's a bad way of thinking about applied ethics, and that's to think that it involves unilateral and derivative thinking. So by unilateral, I just mean one way. So you do the ethics and then you apply it, and there's no kind of move back. And then by derivative, I mean the application must follow from the ethics. So you do the ethics first, and then you apply it. And again, there's kind of no going backwards. So a kind of standard view of that is pick your favorite ethical theory out of one bucket, find a kind of emerging horror, technological horror from another bucket, and kind of mash the two together. So what would a utilitarian say about some technological problem? What would a Kantian say about some other technological problem? So my worry about that sort of approach is the conclusions drawn are often a bit bland, because the conclusions drawn are often, it sort of depends, right? Like it depends on how you use the technology. You might use it well, you might use it poorly. And so it's a bit general, and as I say, the conclusions often aren't that helpful. There's also a worry about novelty. So I sometimes think when people think about applied ethics, they think, oh, the conclusions must be novel. So we to demonstrate the value, we demonstrate novelty. And again, I worry that we end up with this kind of, it's not blandness, it's more about fragmentation. The worry here is about, we end up with these really fine-grained distinctions between different ethical theories or different technological uses where, oh, I'm not doing what you're doing. For my thing to be novel, it must be distinguished. And so it's just kind of pointless distinction going on. As I say, not everyone thinks like this, but I worry that some people do, and I think that it's not very helpful in ethical thinking, because I think ethical thinking ought to be action guiding, as it says at the bottom of this slide. And so sort of crude, bland, and fragmented, that's not the way to go. So how should we be thinking about these things? So it ought not to surprise people, and Ben and Jess and Carl, I suspect, are happy to hear reflective equilibrium is about to pop up. I think we should probably think about these things in a sort of holistic way, right? So again, against this idea of unilateralism, against this idea that you do the ethics and then you do the application and you don't move between the two, that seems kind of strange, right? My thought is we can tell something useful about the quality of an ethical framework. Oh, someone's iPhone is speaking. That's exciting. We can tell something useful about the quality of an ethical framework by how well we can apply it, right? So the successful application tells us something about the framework itself. And if you think unilaterally, that's not going to make much sense. But I think we should be thinking about the quality of the ethical framework at the same time. I also think about the scope of particular problems. So one worry about derivative thinking is that it doesn't allow us to trace back particular applied concerns to core moral problems. And I think that's a useful thing to do sometimes. So if we are thinking about a kind of particular application of an ethical theory to a real world problem, and it turns out we can trace it back to some core problem, separateness of persons, mere means, doing and allowing, ought implies can, something like that, I think that's a really helpful insight. And again, if you just want to derive the application from the ethics, I think you're going to miss that kind of thing because you're not going to go backwards. And I hope you can understand why novelty for novelty's sake isn't great. Sometimes it's useful. Novelty is helpful. It's constructive and productive in some senses. But we're aiming for plausibility, right? We're not aiming for quick answers. We want good answers. And good answer, novelty is helpful when it helps us produce good answers, but that's only an instrumental relationship. So that's my thought about how we should be thinking about the ethics of AR. There are some sort of things to try and avoid, basically, some sorts of worries. And then with a forward-looking eye to talking to non-philosophers about this, again, I think being quite clear about how ethical theories evolve and how philosophers tend to demonstrate their expertise, again, thinking sort of holistically about, thinking about ethical theories, thinking about particular problems, applying A to B, but then working backwards, thinking about what have we learned from the ethical theory from the application to the problem, going from B to A again, and thinking reflectively and seeking a kind of balance here. Lots of philosophers, to my eyes, seem to work like that. But that might look quite strange to some non-philosophers. And so being clear about how ethical reasoning can sometimes work in this holistic manner might be quite helpful. That's one thought. And the second thought is, as I said before, one thing that project members might want to think a little bit about is whether there is a contrast between the sort of ethical claims that we derive from our thinking and then the metaphysical or the epistemological claims. So I'm not sure we should expect all of those branches of philosophy to kind of proceed in the same way. The way I put it here is contrasting consistency and uniformity. So I would want, by the end of this, a consistent story between these branches of philosophy. The metaphysicians and the epistemologists and the ethicists all have a consistent story to tell, but it might be that we develop it in a non-uniform manner, or it might be that the application of those theories to the problems isn't uniform in that way. So again, a kind of looseness, but a coherence or a consistency. My thought is that might be one aim to pursue. Okay, methodological worries. Right, we've talked about how to think about ethical reasoning. Now we should do some ethical reasoning. That was my thought. So the next two are broadly political, distribution and then legitimacy. So on the distribution front, this was picked up in a previous talk, but I think it's important to explore a little bit. There are different ways of thinking about how augmented reality might interact with claims of distributive justice. So pick any distribuenda, the thing that we're distributing in our theory, primary goods, claims about welfare, particular social relations, whatever you think the distribution thing is. If we can trace an effect on that thing to augmented reality, then we get a kind of contingent claim, or augmented reality matters to our distribution through its relationship with the thing we're meant to be distributing. And my sense is that's going to work in both directions. So there could be claims, and again, a previous speaker talked in some detail about this, about how augmented reality could help mitigate or alleviate particular disadvantages. Well, if it turns out if those disadvantages partly ground claims in distributive justice, now we have a contingent claim between distributive justice, the alleviation or mitigation of a disadvantage, and augmented reality. And that might trigger particular concerns. So one you see in the literature sometimes is about, if we're trying to alleviate a particular problem, do we give someone the non-fungible, non-universal method of good, like not method of exchange? So do we give them the particular thing? Or do we just give them the fungible, universal means of exchange, the cash? Do we just pay them instead? How are we resolving the relationship, and what's the nature of the claim? Would it require a claim to AR specifically, or would it require a claim to cash? That's one sort of debate that might be raised here. And again, those sorts of puzzles are partly empirical, but also they're partly normative. And so keeping those concerns in mind might be helpful. My thought is it would work in the other direction as well. So that's a claim about disadvantage. You can also get claims about advantage. It might be that augmented reality is necessary, or access to that would be necessary to pursue particular goods. For example, valuable forms of work will be one example of that. And again, if that's true, then you're going to get claims of distributive justice kind of filtering down here. Pick your pattern of distribution, pick the relationship between that and work, and then pick the relationship between work and AR. And the pattern of distribution is going to kind of tumble down through all that, I think. So that's one thought. There are different ways of thinking about the relationship between AR and distributive justice. One thing I wanted to draw attention to, no pun intended, is what some of the previous speakers were talking about in terms of attention. So in that previous slide, we were just talking generally about augmented reality and various valuable things that we might have claims to distributive justice on. Well, some people think that there is a relationship between distributive justice and attention itself, and augmented reality looks like it has particular implications or important implications for attention. So we've talked in a previous session, for example, about distraction, right? Digital distraction. Are we worried about that? Here you might think, because augmented reality has important relationships with our attention, it can shape our attentions in a particular way, it can distract us in a particular way, so on and so on. You might think that if there are claims of distributive justice that relate to attention, then they're going to matter to AR. So again, there's two ways of thinking about that. One is intrinsic. So it's to say that attention is itself a matter of distributive justice. So people think that about time, for example. Some people think issues of time can ground claims of distributive justice. And then you might think something like that true of attention as well. iPhone is beeping at me again. Oh, there we go, it's gone. Alternatively, as the previous slide suggested, we could also have these contingent relationships. So even if attention itself isn't a thing that's being distributed, or the relationship isn't that clear, we could have situations where attention is really important, for example, well-being, or for access to opportunities, or for the use of primary goods. And if those things ground claims of distributive justice, then ta-da, AR gets a link that way as well. So there, I hope you can see there are different ways of thinking about the relationship between augmented reality and claims of distributive justice. There are more and less sort of direct relationships we can draw, but my sense is there probably are some relationships to be drawn there and to be sketched out and thought about. Okay, I'll keep the political philosophers busy. Next worry, so halfway through now. This is a claim about legitimacy. So we're still in the political realm. We still care about the state and its relationship to citizens. But this isn't about the sort of who gets what question of distributive justice. It's more about democratic legitimacy. So particular concerns about how parties reason with each other, and whether AR is going to have bad effects on that or bad effects on how we, the levels of sort of disagreement between us. So the way I was thinking about this is to, forget AR for a minute, just think about standard sort of partisan media, either in the modern age, so include social media in that story, or in previous times. So just think about newspapers, right? Newspapers are often quite partisan. Just that form of media, again, setting aside AR, those sorts of media can raise questions about social cohesion. And contemporary debates about that, in my eyes at least, they move in two different ways. So one set of concerns look like they're about deception specifically, or maybe perhaps more broadly manipulation. So these are debates about fake news and false beliefs, as I put on the slide there. I think some people are really worried about that kind of thing. That to me looks a little bit different, although it is related. My sense is there is some sort of distinction to be done here between that and worries about divergence. So here, think about filter bubbles and think about polarization. So it's true that filter bubbles inform what you believe. Divergence can be motivated by differing beliefs, and the news and beliefs thing. There is a kind of story, there is a relationship there. But I think you can worry about kind of deception and manipulation in the absence of divergence. I can worry about it just in and of itself. Like I might just think deceiving people is bad, regardless of whether two people end up disagreeing with each other more because of it. And so I think there are distinct concerns here, but they do travel together. So one set of worries about media and social cohesion is about deception and about manipulation. And another one is about divergence, about this idea that they're kind of driving us apart as a group. Now, those concerns are partly epistemic, but I hope you can see that they do raise political concerns. So issues of democratic legitimacy might be created or raised by these sorts of worries. There's at least two ways that can happen. One, you might think democracy requires a model of shared reasoning. So you and I ought to be thinking together. And these forms of media might make that harder. Alternatively, you might think we don't need to reason together, but we do need to both accept a disagreement resolution mechanism. So even if you and I don't need to be thinking together in a direct way, we need a system that we all agree on to help resolve disagreements, right? We need kind of like outer limits or an agreement on how to solve problems when disagreement appears intractable. My worry is that media can cause a problem for those things, and so they can challenge legitimacy. And then to bring AR into the picture, if AR augments those things, so if it makes media more of a concern, so move from a filter bubble to a perception bubble, for example, then we might have troubling consequences both on the epistemic ground, which we've covered in previous talks, but also with these social political implications as well, because of the relationship between democratic legitimacy and the epistemology in the political sphere. So that's one worry. One way of sketching that out, or one way I was thinking about this, was to think in terms of domination. So political philosophers will know there's a sort of, there's a concern, it's most well known in the Republican tradition, Republican theories of liberty, but really relationally egalitarians often worry about these sorts of concerns as well. The idea here is that domination is used in a particular way. It's a structural relation concerning, I put it here, concerning forms of vulnerability to arbitrary interference. But basically the idea is it's not about outcomes. It's not I am coercing you, I am harming you. It's that you and I are in such a relationship that you can't protect yourself if I interfere with your life for no good reason. That's the arbitrary bit there. So it's a kind of lack of immunity. It's like you can't protect yourself. So if I did intervene, you couldn't stop me. I don't have to intervene. It's just the mere relationship that's the worry there. As I say, different groups of political theorists worry about this problem for different reasons. But one of the sort of legitimacy puzzles I was worried about was I was interested in whether that sort of relationship could occur in the perceptual realm through this technology. So, you know, imagine there are news companies can shape our attention in particular ways, and they can inform us in particular ways, and they can allow us to perceive the world in particular ways. That seems like one way of thinking about traditional media. Media might play that role, or at least plays part of that role. But if it moves into the perceptual realm more directly through augmented reality, you might think these concerns are more pressing. And so you might want to look out for those sorts of concerns. Now, your mileage with domination may vary. Often it's cashed out in counterfactual terms. So as I said before, it's a structural relation. It doesn't actually require me to coerce you or harm you. I just to stand in a particular relationship to you. So that if I chose to, you couldn't stop me. And some people worry about that because they worry about the counterfactual. The counterfactual seems bad. And some people aren't worried about that because it's purely counterfactual. Until I harm you or coerce you, you know, just because I stand in a particular relation, why is that a moral concern? So if there is disagreement about that within the group, that might be part of what's explaining the disagreement, the role of the counterfactual part of the domination analysis. But if people are concerned, again, that might be part of the story to be told. Okay, last set of concerns. So hopefully, so far, I've told a relatively coherent story. There were some methodological worries and some sort of pitfalls or traps that I thought we should try to avoid. And then there was a pair of concerns which I see as broadly social and political, though they draw on the epistemology. One was about distribution and one was about legitimacy. This last group is a bit broader. I've called it rather unambitiously interpersonal worries. Now, you might think that's not a great title because guess what? Legitimacy, that's interpersonal. Distribution, that's interpersonal. Domination, that sounds pretty interpersonal to me. But here my thought is there's something going on here which isn't just directly traced back to the state. There's something else going on. You and I could do this to each other without the state being involved. And that's worth carving out specifically. So one set of concerns, and I take it this was part of when Ben before was saying, the earlier brief was a bit narrower, the harms about things which people learn about us or own about us, or however the phrasing was. I take it one of those sets of concerns was a privacy set of concerns, right? So like privacy is definitely one concern. And of course, privacy from the state, that's a big problem. So there is a political version of this. But even just interpersonally, you know, between private parties, between myself and a firm, however it works, there are obviously privacy concerns here. Again, previous talks have picked this up. You can think about it in terms of tracking, and you can think about it in terms of surveillance, both of which, you know, again, there's a relationship, but they could be distinguished. You add a bit of surveillance capitalism and the attention economy into the mix. You might think there's a kind of combustible combination of issues there. And then, yeah, a previous speaker was talking about the global panopticon as well, right? The possibility of a distributed, augmented, and algorithmically guided set of surveillance techniques. Again, sounds quite scary to me. And so there are those sorts of concerns to reason through. There are two others I just want to finish up on. One is one that I'm concerned about. This is me adding one into the mix. And I've presented about this in Glasgow before. So I have this worry about immersion, largely for reasons of responsibility and for reasons of manipulation. But I'm a bit worried about this idea that there could be distinctive kinds of immersion. You and I could become immersed in a particular thing in different ways. And that these different ways could interact with each other reflectively. So imagine there's like a kind of broad version of immersion and then a deeper form of immersion. It could be the case that breadth drives depth, and then depth maintains breadth. And people, it's a bit like a corkscrew, people just become increasingly immersed and more remote from other parties. So there could be ways in which AR immerses us, which itself could be a problem, like just the form of immersion or its consequences could be troublesome, perhaps. For example, for responsibility reasons or something like that. Final thought, normative powers. Thought it'd be nice to talk about normative powers, because I don't feel like they've come up so much recently, but I do think they're super important. So here the idea was to think through framing effects, which is a particular debate in AR. So the framing effects debate gets going by distinguishing between what information you know and then how information is presented to you. And the idea here, so that's the first bullet point. The second bullet point, we know that how information is presented has important effects on the resulting informed decision. That's a sort of slippery bit, but it's worth thinking about. So we tend to worry in legal and medical and political contexts that parties are informed, right? It's informed consent that's the standard that we worry about. We want people to make informed decisions. But when we think about informed, we tend to think about the amount of information parties know. Do they know the relevant information? And sometimes we care less about how that information is presented to them. But the empirical people will tell us how the information is presented to them is also important to the decision that's made. And so, there's lots of literature in choice architecture and nudging about framing effects in general. And one of the strands of that is about consent. So if consent matters and informed consent matters, should we think about informed consent both about how much information parties know and also how that information is presented to them, given that the empirical people will tell us that both of those things matter to the decision that results. So that's one thought. Then there's this thought about how does augmented reality change how information is presented to us? Does augmented reality have distinctive framing effects? Does it do similar sorts of framing effects that we find elsewhere, but it sort of supercharges them, makes them more private, for example, or increases the opacity to other parties? Or is there something distinctive going on here? I mean, might be one sort of puzzle. And then I thought was interested in the extension from consent to other normative powers. So I always think consent kind of hogs the limelight. It's an important normative power, but there are obviously other ones out there. Promises are one that's close to my heart. Forgiveness is another. There are lots of different normative powers that require communication, and they have important effects on the moral landscape, right? Creating wage duties and so on. And so we could extend the consent puzzle to other normative powers. That might be worth doing. So is a promise made in AR different from consent made in AR? If I forgive you in AR, does that, is that different again? What's going on there? And then the final thought is, and this is tracing back to the metaphysics, not the epistemology. So far, I've been talking a lot about the epistemological talks. Here, when in the metaphysical talks, there was quite a lot of discussion about realism in AR and fictionalism in AR. And there was a sort of ontological puzzle about to what extent is this stuff real or not, depending on how you think about realism. And I was just interested in whether the metaphysicians had a view about how that debate translates into things like normative powers. So if we think it's all fictional, for example, do you think my consent is fictional? Or do you think my consent is real in AR, even if you think the story about AR is ultimately fictional? Like, are we kind of guided by that? Do we have to be realists about the metaphysics to say that these normative powers work in a real way? Or can there be a mismatch? Can you be a fictionalist about some of the metaphysics, but still buy some realism in the realism in the normative realm? I just wanted to think a little bit about that as well, because I thought that'd be helpful. It'd be a bit of a problem if everything we did in AR was fictional, for example. Okay, that's my time up. It's 35. So we've caught back up to your schedule, Ben. You'll be happy to hear. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Why don't you stop sharing your screens, Chris?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Did that make sense?
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I think as a first stab at these ethical questions, it's great, because I think looking at what Sarah and Carl are going to be talking about, they're going to be drilling into particular case studies almost of some of these considerations that you've raised. So fantastic.
Yeah, I'm much too indecisive for that. So yeah, I'm glad to hear other people are going to do that.
Fine. That's I think opening cans of worms is the job of the workshop today. Okay, so folks, we have a bit of time for questions. As usual, please, the easiest thing for you to do, I think, is for you to raise your hand in the using the raise hand function in reaction here. If there's something specific that you want to follow up on from another person's question, then it might be easiest if you send me a private message letting me know that you'd like to jump the queue, and I'll make a judgment based on sort of how the discussion's panning out. Fiona, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks. I so enjoyed that. I just feel like you've you really did go back and look at what we were saying and pick up on things and try and categorize them for us. I really liked your almost the last point you made about framing concerns. So I think that augmented reality is incredibly powerful in the way it can frame certain things. So we've spoken before about how augmented reality might highlight certain products on a shelf, or might, bring your attention to certain things. But I also wonder if there's a sort of a negative way of doing something like that. Instead of highlighting something and making it salient to you, there can be ways in which it removes something and makes it not salient when it should be. So I was thinking here of, we've talked about examples of where you might be walking through a city and certain slums and slum areas and homeless people are masked from you. Now, you might have the information that there are such slums and such homeless people in a city, but if you can't see them, it removes their salience and it frames things in a very different way. So I just suddenly thought that there might be this kind of a positive and a negative way of framing certain information that I hadn't really thought of before.
Yeah, sure. Yes, so that's right, Fiona. So I went back. The only one I couldn't fit in that I wanted to was how many skeletons are behind the door. I couldn't work out how to get that talk into this. I couldn't see the ethical puzzle, but I did try and draw on some other ones. Yeah, yeah, good. So I hope the kind of taxonomy idea is sort of helpful. I don't know. I was a bit worried it might be a bit loose, but hopefully it's sort of helpful. On the framing, yeah, so that's definitely right. So that the kind of positive and negative, I think that's true. There's one thing to be wary of is so one way of thinking about it is to think that every time you increase the salience, you can think salience is like scarce. So if I increase the salience of one thing, I'm drawing your attention to A, I'm simultaneously reducing the salience of other things because I'm drawing your attention away from B. So yeah, every time you do you do one thing, you sort of reduce the others by comparison. Alternatively, you could just think about it in absolute terms. So I am just increasing the salience of A, I am just decreasing the salience of B. You don't have to see them necessarily related. You might do, but you might not. On that thought about blocking, for example, slums, you can imagine making, was there an example in a previous talk where like somebody's going in on a train and there's like, they've blocked out all the signs? That rings a bell. Yeah, good. So that's right. So it's a nice example of, something is there, but it's your kind of perception of it is interfered with and it's sort of masked in some way, say, something like that. And so you might worry, there could be some distinct worries about those sorts of things, right? So imagine you think the sorts of relations we have with each other matter sort of in and of themselves. And you might worry that, look, by kind of having the suffering of others blocked to me for reasons of aesthetic preference, like, it's not so nice looking at all these people who are living worse lives than me. You might think that it interferes with the relations that we have. They could prevent us from forming relationships that could benefit us or others. You might have like a dehumanization worry here, kind of floating around in the area. Who are you to block the suffering of others just for that reason? Yeah, there could be a kind of series of concerns floating around there. As I said in the talk, a lot of the debate about framing, at least as I read it, is often about that kind of normative powers question. So it's about how does it affect your decision making? Have you really consented in an informed way, et cetera, et cetera. This looks like a much broader set of puzzles, which is just about, it's not about the choice, like no choice could hang on this. It could be about relations, it could be about opportunities. Imagine certain people have particular opportunities highlighted to them and other people don't, for example. You might think there's an equality of opportunity puzzle there. Again, it's got nothing to do with decisions, it's just how information is provided to you. So thinking it through, yeah, if that's a potential consequence of AR, then that's something to think through. Again, what we want to avoid is what I said at the start, which is that depends how it's used sort of conclusion, because it's going to depend how it's used, right? But the worry is, I suppose the concern is, we want to know a bit more than that. We either want to trace out the things to avoid, because that tells us how it should be used, or we could aim for, you know, benchmarks of this is a, you know, these are good things, these are what we should try to aim for. Again, just moving a bit better than, I hope the bad people don't do bad things with this new technology. My thought is that's not the world's most interesting conclusion, even though it's not controversial. Okay.
I had something which sort of connected the point that Fiona's just talked through with you, Chris, to the stuff about domination. Because when you were talking, I was quite, I think it's very useful to think that domination is one of those ethical or political concerns that should be live here. You sort of talked about the danger of the person who is using AR technology being dominated. That makes using AR might make you vulnerable to certain kinds of things or certain forms of manipulation in ways that we think are problematic. But I think that Fiona's question points out that there might also be third-party effects here. That is to say, there might be harms of domination that third parties suffer from your attention being directed in certain ways rather than others. So presumably, I mean, the primary reason that we think it's bad that the slums are disguised from you is not just that perhaps it makes you less in contact with the world and that's bad for you. It's that slums will persist and poverty will persist if people who are passing by on trains don't realize that those things are there. So I think maybe one of the ingredients we want to put in is to notice that there might be ethical concerns about use of AR where the primary worry ought not to be for the user, but ought to be for third parties. Now, I've sketched out a version of that that has to do with domination, but I wonder whether any of the other sort of the other items in your smorgasbord might sort of be distinguished into first and third party effects as well.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, that's entirely possible. So one thing to think through might be, is the issue somebody's losing out on something that they had a claim to? Because, so imagine somebody's owed my attention and my attention is distracted and I'm off looking at something else and they kind of miss out on something that they otherwise have a claim to. That's one sort of worry. Trying to think if there are others, if there's a kind of flip side concern. Do you worry that there could be cases where you owe me your attention and you give it to me, so your attention is not misplaced, but you give me far too much. So it's not paying enough attention, it's actually kind of going too far in the other direction. I'm kind of overly concerned with particular things, perhaps more so than I should.
Where the idea is that might be harmful to you or
no, to third parties. So again, they're kind of missing out, but not because I'm ignoring them, but because I'm focusing too much. Maybe it's just the same. It's just different route to the same problem, perhaps.
It's a good question. It was one that I was thinking through myself, and where I think it would be. I suspect this might come up in relation to Carl's talk as well, that it would be useful to know from people more versed in psychology and the philosophy of mind than I am, to know how far this model of attention and salience being a zero-sum game is actually borne out by what we know about how the mind actually works. Because I think that our evaluation of the opportunity costs in this type of thing are going to depend upon whether we think it's a rival good that is being distributed.
Yeah, that's right. I think, yeah, go on.
I suppose, I mean, my worry is that it's very tempting for ethicists and political philosophers to use these kind of crudely mechanistic ways of thinking about how the mind works. If the ethical concerns here are an artifact of that rather crude view, or if that view is rather crude, then it may be that it's a helpful use of the mixed expertise we have in this group to sort of overturn that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, my thought is just like, I think it's going to matter whether the judgments we need to make are necessarily comparative or not. Like if it's zero sum, then we've got to start, then opportunity cost matters, and it has to be comparative. Whereas if that's just not how the brain works, for example, or how attention works, or something like that, then actually those concerns might change shape. That's the idea. They might still be live, but we might have to think about them a little bit differently. And just to say, an excellent example of philosophical judo there, I turn the question back on Ben, and Ben answered it himself. Thank you very much, Ben.
Super. Matteo, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, first, thank you for the talk. It was amazing. I was wondering, also on the topic of attention span and highlighting, framing some things other than others. I was wondering, okay, it might sound a bit confused, but in a world in which I can access AR whenever I want, and maybe I have my goggles, I have my glasses, and I don't want to take them off every time, it might be, there might be the possibility that, unbeknownst to me, I am excluded something. So something is removed from my eyesight and I don't recognize it. So my question is, should we deliberate, do you think, on the transparency of the technology of AR, in the sense that should the user be able always to access the technology and make the changes they require in order to be fully aware of what's happening? So what the technology is framing and what not.
Yeah, good. Hang on. So, two thoughts. One is, in direct response to the question, is probably yes, like some sort of user control will be helpful, but there's got to be limits on it. So one is, you can have these cases where something is customizable to such an extent that I lack the expertise to make meaningful use of the customization. Like I just don't know, I'm fiddling with some buttons and I don't know what I'm changing now because it's just too advanced for me. There's a kind of knowledge problem about control, and there's also just a kind of range of options kind of thought. So it's really important to have a bunch of options, but there's diminishing returns on some of these things. So there could be such a thing as like too much scope for control or customization just because we can't make meaningful use of it. What really matters is that we have the right sorts of control, not the kind of maximalist view. Just on the original thought, the thought that motivated your concern about, it sounded like kind of like inadvertent or accidental kind of occlusion or kind of missing certain things. I suppose one thing you could do is rely on sort of intentionality as an excuse, right? So it could be like, I intended for my attention to be shaped in particular ways, and then there are these side effects which arose as well. And you might think that they're less concerning, not just because of the effect, but because of the kind of mental structure behind them. Like, if you accidentally overlook a thing, it's true that you've overlooked it, but it is an accident, and that might matter in our judgments as well. But yeah, on response to the primary thing, yes, I think so, but there have got to be some sort of tricky constraints, I think. Okay?
Thank you.
Jess, you have a question.
Yes, sorry, Chris. I just wanted to ask a bit more about the distributive kind of worries and exactly what the worry is. Like, so is it that we're like sort of problematically expanding the scope of distributive justice into like things which just seem like a kind of just sort of a wanton expansion of the sphere of justice into like far too much, which I don't know, doesn't seem that kind of problematic to me, because it does just seem that like specifying the boundaries of justice is necessarily going to kind of change, and in just the way that like our entitlement to kind of unimagined medical technology will increase. We'll now have entitlements to medical technology we couldn't have imagined a few decades ago. The same could be true. Or is it that we kind of like we're going to sort of end up like forcing people to make use of this against their will, as like, if you want what you're entitled to, the only way to get it now is to like put on the goggles or whatever. So then it ends up being that like sort of justice demands people to buy into an ethically fraught system. Or is it something else that I'm just not getting? But sorry, yeah.
look, Jess, you know this stuff much better than I do. So here's my idiot's worry, and then I'll explain why you've just given me a much better version of it. So my idiot's worry was, I think we should be careful. So it's not a concern. It's not the first thing at all. I'm not like you. I'm not worried about that. I just wanted to draw attention to the idea that there are different sorts of relationships that could occur between AR and distributive justice. So I don't want someone to say, oh, I'm a Rawlsian, I care about primary goods, AR isn't a primary good, who cares? Move on. Because the idea is, sure, but AR could affect various things that, like primary goods, for example, and so we should just be careful and think through the relationships. And on the slides, my thought was, some of these relationships could be quite direct, but some of these relationships could be quite indirect, or contingent, as I put it there. And then one of the things I'm particularly interested in is this stuff about attention, right? Attention and time and mental faculties, and like, some people think that stuff matters a lot for distribution and some people don't. Some people think that matters a lot for disadvantage, some people don't. So just thinking through like distributive matters and matters of disadvantage or advantage, but in a way that correlates with the sorts of things that AR picks up on, perception, attention, whatever cognitive faculties, etc. My thought was, that's the thing to think through. The second thing that you just raised, this idea that, look, to get access to some of these goods, you're going to have to plug in. That is not a concern that I've picked up on in the talk, but I do think it might be a significant concern to think through. So the kind of layman's version is the kind of computer illiterate person goes to the job center and the job center says, you got to go apply for some jobs, here's a computer. That's the only way you can do it. And you've got to do the application to receive support. And I do worry about those sorts of cases. If we require a sort of certain bits of technology to interact in a social manner that justice demands, and we don't provide support or training for that sort of thing, that's a problem, right? Because it's like an access problem. And I take it the second worry you raised might be a sort of access problem, because we're requiring you to plug in, we're kind of requiring you to access something which either you're not very prepared for or might be ethically fraught in other ways. Is that a long-winded version of saying the second thing you said back?
Yeah, no, so I think part of it is that kind of worry of like the access, but I guess part of it is maybe like a sort of a worry analogous to some of the stuff around like compensating for impairments and that kind of thing, which is that like that when certain things become essential, you can't just keep like functioning as you are. I mean, it depends how, like, I haven't been to all of the workshops, but it depends how kind of like conceptualizing the technology, but that we're somehow, it's not quite body modification, but it's kind of, I don't know, like perception modification. We're somehow being like compelled to alter the way that we see the world or something just in order to get what we're entitled to. So that seems like it doesn't seem to solve the problems to ensure like equal access to that, because it's like, because we're being maybe asked to do something we shouldn't be asked to do, like in the same way you shouldn't like necessarily be asking some like, people with impairments to like, oh, well, you can like get what you're entitled to, you just got to like take the cure for your impairment, or whatever, you just got to change the way you see the world, like get rid of your autism and you'll be fine. They might think there's something kind of analogous going on, which like people could object to. Yeah, but that's helpful.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, Jess. So I think that's right. So I think there's like, there's this, there's a kind of, there's a sort of distributive question, and then there's an access question, but the access question has this other element, which is if we're required to access, like if the whole thing is bad, right? It's like a systemic problem. If the whole thing's bad, and requiring people to access is very tricky. Yeah, good. I like that thought.
Okay, folks, I think we've reached time for this discussion. I think there's much more that we could say, but I suspect it'll crop up as well further over the next couple of workshops. So let's thank Chris very much for a stimulating paper and an interesting Q&A.